Yes, Carol?
Okay, I'm ready. My name is Carol Kaufman, and I am the founder and CEO of a company called CB Data Life Inventory Solutions. We create a family's life inventory, which is one of the most important things because it pulls together all of your important information about a family's life. In times like these, with climate change and people living longer, which results in healthcare and economic and even natural disaster challenges, our webinar is very timely and is meant to be just a beginning. It's also a great way to start your Memorial Day weekend. I'm very glad that I met Jack because when we do life inventories for our clients, people always ask us, how do we start the conversation? Those very difficult ones. So I am going to be introducing you to Jack, who is the author of a book called Having the Talk, The Four Keys to Your Parents' Safe Retirement, and Safe for Retirement, The Four Keys to a Safe Retirement. What's interesting is that Jack and I have had conversations because I believe that this is not just for retirement, this is for life. So I will encourage all of you to ask questions in the question panel, and I will be interjecting those questions as Jack speaks. We will be having two live webinars, starting with this one, and each webinar will have a Google Meetup from 7 to 8 p.m. There will be one tonight, and there will be one next Thursday to answer any unanswered questions and to continue conversation. Jack will give you more detail at the end of the session. So, with that as an introduction, Jack, question number one: who should be part of the talk?
Well, Carol, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming in and joining us today. Now, just to be clear for everyone, this is called Having the Talk. So if you came to this thinking that we're going to be discussing things about sex ed and talking to your teenager, that's not what this is about. This is rather the talk that you have with your parents or that your parents have with their adult children about those issues related to retirement and later life. So it is a discussion that does happen between the parents and their adult children. It's a talk that typically is had, oftentimes it's had too late. We're going to talk about when is the right time to have this, but let me talk a little bit about kind of the concept of the talk. We're going to go into some real specifics about what to include in the talk, because what we found is we found that this becomes a necessary discussion that people have. But unfortunately, they're ill-equipped in terms of the tools and resources to go and do this. So what we're going to be presenting to you today is at least my approach to addressing the issues that should be discussed in the talk. And a lot of times when you hear people say, "Oh, I need to have this talk with my parents," or the parents say, "I need to have this talk with my adult children," it gets around the discussion about, well, what to do with issues about long-term care or wills or things of that nature. What we're going to discuss today is actually showing you that there's a lot more that needs to be discussed there for the well-being of the parent and the well-being of the family. We're going to go over some things related not only to long-term care, caregiving challenges, who's going to be taking care of people, medical proxies, we're going to be discussing that, estate planning, trusts. We're also going to go into things related to the well-being of the retiree and the issues that come up for people in later life, such as health issues, their life in retirement, and then also that concern that is typically thought of when we think about the talk, which is what do we do when death comes along? What are the plans that we want to make? So there is a lot that we're looking to discuss here, and what we're going to be going over, I want to be very clear to everybody. This is a process. This is not going to be something that's going to be a hallmark moment where everyone's sitting around the table, everyone's smiling, everyone's getting this information out. It's not, probably not going to be a hallmark moment. It's a process. It's not something that's easy, and it's something that needs to be done. Let me come back a little bit. I know Carol talked about and asked me who should be part of this talk. And let me talk a little bit about the fact that, as I mentioned, this is a discussion between the adult children and the parents. But yet, AARP found, they did a survey, and 2/3 of adult children have never talked about these matters with their parents. And I'm talking about all of these matters, okay? Typically, there's a discussion that's had and between families. And unfortunately, quite often, it's not had with the parents, and it's not done at the right time. So when you look at this, you start to say, why is this not happening? Why are these vital discussions not being undertaken? Or why are they being done too late? We're going to talk about timing and when is the best time to do this. I mean, is it just because they're just awkward for most people? Yes, they are. It is not an easy conversation to have. Do we ever know when the time is right? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about, I think, when the right time is to have it. Or are we also in a situation where we're afraid of what our parents will think of our motives or other family members? Whatever is the case, and we're going to talk a lot about this. This is not something that's only for the adult child to do with the parent, but the parent can also bring this up as well. And the important aspect here is it's not important who breaks, let's call it the silence, who brings this up. But the reality is that the discussion needs to happen.
I do have a question,
Sure, Carol.
and that is, you talk about the adult child and the parent. Where do the siblings fit in? What if they're not all on board?
Well, this is obviously a very interesting point, a point that we find, and I actually have to speak from personal experience here. That I've seen situations in my own family where a lot of things about end of life issues resulted in sibling rivalries and people not speaking to each other. So let me address this because I think it is very important and it's something that a lot of us encounter. You know, the reality is we end up living typically with our siblings longer than we've lived with our parents. And there is a need to just make sure that everyone is on board with whatever discussion happens here. Now, that can mean that if you have a situation where siblings do not get along, or if there's issues out there, and certainly when you're talking about the transition of property or transition of wealth, these can often be taboo conversation topics, and it can lead to squabbles between siblings because these things mean different things to a lot of to different family members. It is very important that the family is on board, and the parent can play a role here. The parent can play a role of really stressing to people and the family that, look, what's most important here is to do what's right for the family, and also understand and stress the fact that these are our wishes. These are the parents' wishes. So they need to be very clear at the start that doing this is going to be good for them and ultimately good for the children. You may find that there may be certain issues related to siblings. Some sibling may be saying that I'm better equipped to this, or I live far away, or whatever. Those needs need to be discussed, and those concerns need to be discussed and recognized when we're doing the talk. So everyone needs to be on board. Now, we will find, and you may find, that no matter what you do, and the best intentions, and the parent coming together and saying, look, we need to do this for the family, you may find even with the best of intentions that the family still cannot come together. If that's the case, then what you need to do is take a look at a situation where ultimately you have to name an executor to an estate. And what may end up happening is, for siblings who can't get along, it doesn't mean that the talk stops there. it means that the talk needs to happen, but you may have to involve an outside executor, a third party mediator. Now, one other point that I just want to bring up here as well. We're going to cover a lot of things related to the talk. It's not just about estates. It's not just about who's getting what. There's a lot of other issues in here, medical issues and things along those lines. There may be a situation where one sibling may be better equipped than another sibling to discuss these topics. But what's important, Carol mentioned this before, what's important is putting all this information into one place so that it's accessible and that the whole family has access to it and can understand what has been decided. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later on. But I understand that that's a concern, and maybe we can get into some specific questions about it. But as I mentioned, where that situation is that the siblings just can't get along, we may have to look at some third-party executors and third-party mediators to kind of jump into this. Does that help, Carol?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great.
Move on.
All right, let's take a look at, as I mentioned before, the talk is something that's a family-based discussion. We talked a little bit about maybe the roadblocks that may be there about siblings. We've also discussed that this is not just about long-term care, and this is not about the talk that you have when you're a teenager, but just in the same way that your parents had to talk with you when you were younger, it's now your turn and responsibility to have this talk with them. It's hard. It's not impossible. What we're going to do today is provide you with some of the tools and resources that you need. You supply the love and the courage to really get this going. Understand that the focus here should be on the well-being of the parent and the family. And ultimately, the talk should provide a mechanism to allow your parents' hopes, dreams, and wishes to be fulfilled. And we're going to talk about that going forward.
Okay, so what is the talk? Why do we have it? And when should we have it?
Okay, as I mentioned before, the talk encompasses a lot of things. But now let's recognize here something that you have to recognize in speaking to your parent at a point in time where they are getting older, where situations have changed. Sitting down with them and discussing topics like this, the parent can feel that, well, you're taking control away from me. It's very, very important that you recognize, we'll talk a little bit more about this, that the parent recognizes that they're not losing control over their lives. And also, you're doing something that benefits the entire family, not only the adult child, but this benefits the entire family. And it's really about showing love and concern. It's also about a time, and we're going to talk about doing this really at the time of entering retirement. It's a real congratulations to your parent that they've gotten to this point, that they're entering a wonderful stage in their life. And ultimately what you get with this is you create a plan, you put things into place that ultimately provides peace of mind for everyone. As I mentioned before, it doesn't need to be initiated specifically by the parent or the child, but it does take a courageous adult to talk about it. Now, we're going to talk about the specifics of what the talk is and all the elements of it. Let's talk a little bit about why you should have the talk. And we're going to talk about why, when you should have the talk. But really what's very important here is that the space is available to have the talk. In fact, Fidelity did a study here that proved that 89% of families agree that having this discussion about health and elder care is important. And in fact, more than 9 in 10 adult children and their parents agreed that it's important to have these frank conversations about wills, estate planning, elder care, or covering retirement expenses, even though there are significant barriers to starting these discussions. Okay, so everyone knows we need to do it. We put it off, but we're going to have it anyway. It's ultimately going to happen, and we want to make sure we have it when everybody's on board. And what we're going to do is provide you the skills and provide you the resources of when to do it and what to do here. So let me talk a little bit about when to have the talk, because I think this is very important. I know a number of you out there are probably looking at your age and you're saying, maybe I'm in a situation where my parents are older and I haven't had this talk with them. So what I'm going to talk about is the optimal time to have this, but understand that if you haven't had this talk with your parents, if you haven't gone over these things, you should have it. But we're going to talk about what I consider to be the optimal time to do this, because let's take a look at some of the realities that are going on here. we understand that as people age, we run into all situations related to health. One of the big things is Alzheimer's. Okay, the numbers are staggering related to Alzheimer's and the number of people who are coming down with Alzheimer's. But when you look at this, and you look at accountants and lawyers and financial advisors who have had experience with clients who have had memory loss or gone into Alzheimer's, invariably they raise the same concern. The fact that the parents and the adult children have been too slow to get help in the early stages of decline. Now, you may look at this as maybe an early stage of Alzheimer's, or it could just be something of a senior moment. But it's important to understand that there are certain warning signs here. And I'm going to take a little bit of a step back because I want to drive these things home for you and understand the role that the adult child can play here. Going and seeing your parents on a fairly regular basis, and this may be when they're retired, when they're living in retirement, this can reveal some real warning signs. You may be able to identify that there's some health issues that they are running into, or even just routine tasks such as balancing a checkbook or missing bill payments. These are things that can be perhaps senior moments or go even beyond that. If there's a decrease in personal hygiene or trouble keeping the home clean or repaired, and ultimately something leading into a tendency towards depression and isolation, can be significant warning signs. Not so much that we need to have the talk, but that it may be later than we think. And that's why we want you to basically have the talk sooner rather than later. And what's important here is when you talk to your siblings or other family members, you can identify some of these triggers. Maybe one child is the child who goes over to the parents more than the others. Okay? You need to kind of identify, if this happens with mom and dad, we have an issue here. Or raise these issues up with your sibling to stress the point that we need to have these discussions with our parents. Let me put up a slide here on that I think is very, very important and speaks to this. This was a study that was done by Professor Michael Fink of Texas Tech. And what he found is that from the age of 60 on, and essentially as people age, their financial literacy decreases. So their ability to understand finances and their overall financial literacy decreases. However, that top line there is their confidence level. So their confidence increases. And that gap there, and this plays again to why it's good to have this discussion, have things in place sooner rather than later. That gap there can be the recipe for financial ruin. This can be where bills don't get paid or calls are made to a parent and they make poor investment decisions, and in essence can be the recipe for financial ruin. And a lot of financial advisors are recognizing this, and they're saying we need to put financial plans into place sooner rather than later, not leave a lot of those financial decisions to later on when we see a decrease in financial literacy. It's better to do this earlier rather than later. And I know, Carol, this was a slide that you were very interested in as well.
I am, because I see this slide, I think it's a great slide, and I see this particular trend as a recipe for scams. As people get older, the reality of their knowledge base and their financial literacy goes down, but their confidence is high, so they
I think that's a very interesting point. I'll just a quick aside story here. I actually wrote an article recently around Thanksgiving related to the fact that perhaps Thanksgiving isn't the best time to have the talk. And it was very funny because after I wrote that article, I was speaking to a friend of mine, and she said, "Oh, we had our entire family together for Thanksgiving, and at the end of the meal, our parents stood up and said, 'We need to discuss something with everyone since we're all here.'" And sure enough, they wanted to basically have the talk. And so there it was, blown right out of the water, that it's not a good time to have it at Thanksgiving. But I think to Carol's point, if you have the family together, beginning the conversation and at least planting the seeds for this conversation is a good time in terms of when to have it and to go forward with it. Now, let me talk about what I think is a very important finding that I've had in taking a look at the research here. And as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about an optimal time when you should have the talk. And this may be feasible for many. It may not be feasible for others out there, but I'm going to throw it out there to you anyway, because I think that this is the point in time when the talk can optimally be had. And it's my belief that when you have this talk and sit down and begin this discussion and start planting the seeds and putting things into place related to the talk at the time when the parent is either near or entering retirement is the right time. And there have been studies, once again, I'm going to reference a Fidelity study that says that really they agree with me that this is the right time to have it. And some of the information is there. And as I mentioned, it's better to have this talk earlier rather than later. Because when you have it later, you run into situations where the parents are either entering mental incapacities, sibling rivalries, there's expectations that have been set. All of those types of things happen later on. It's better to have it earlier rather than later. And that's why I believe that aiming for the time of entering retirement is a good target. So back to your question there earlier, Carol, that's a little bit about why, who, and when, and what is the talk related to. And once again, that when is a very important point. So let's talk a little bit about how do I have the talk. And as I mentioned before, there's this silence barrier that perhaps exists. As we mentioned before, most adult children are not having this conversation. So let's take a look at what some of the obstacles are and some of the ways to approach this. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, later life for your parent is a time to be concerned, but it should also be a time that should be celebrated. Sitting down with your parents at the time of retirement is a great time to pat them on the back and say you've worked hard to get to this point. Congratulate them. Going forward, the family needs information in terms of properly planning for the parent's future. I mean, there's a need to really stress the mutually beneficial activity of gathering all this information. It's good for the parent and it's good for the adult child. Now, also recognizing that the adult child needs to understand that as the parent gets older, there's a sense that they're perhaps losing control over certain things. They're out of the workforce. Of course, they're enjoying their retirement, but as they get older, there is going to be the natural feeling that they're losing control. There's no reason, as you enter the talk, to have the adult parent think that they will not be able to maintain control. You have to put them in control of whatever plan they're building here. And in essence, what you end up doing is create a partnership, a team. And the parents are going to view their adult child as a real valuable resource. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of things that are different in today's environment around technology, around even finances, and Carol mentioned before about scams and planning and all of those different things. The adult child can be a real valuable resource. I mean, think of it. Your parents view you as someone who's very special. They think a lot of you. They're probably very proud of you. You can now step up there and you can say and position the talk as a way for you to help them with the resources that you understand. And your opinions and knowledge will be valued as something that's seen to benefit the family, but also recognize that this is something that you're putting into place that will benefit the whole family and not just something that's self-serving to yourself.
Okay, so to sum it up, you're saying that by the adult child kind of teaming up with the parent, they're creating a team and they're opening up lines of communication by working together in a partnership.
That's correct.
The one comment that I have and questions that come up are retirement. Retirement age, quote unquote, is 65. However, some people can't retire. So, one of the questions is, are you saying that retirement age is the time to have this conversation, or is it when the parent is actually retiring? That's one question.
Right, right.
Another question is, where would I find a
I think it's less about the specific age. Although you have to be careful. Remember that chart that Professor Fink put out there about aging. So we've got to be somewhat cognizant of age. But I would say, and because retirement is so different than just saying 65 is retirement age, I think the way you want to look at this is viewing retirement or the time to have this as a time when there's a significant lifestyle change for the parent. And that may mean that perhaps they're not fully retiring, but they're in essence changing their lifestyle. Maybe all of a sudden they're depending more upon some of their retirement income. They're not fully retiring, they're still working, but they're depending upon more of their retirement income. Or that there's some situation that is basically changing their life. It could be a relocation item. Whatever it is, a lot of times with retirement becomes the time when people become most introspective about their lives changing and taking a look at really planning for the future. So that doesn't mean that that day that they receive the gold watch is the day that you have the talk. The talk can occur when you see these lifestyle changes and the life for your parent changing. Okay, it doesn't mean that they've stopped working, but it's a point in time where you really can identify, okay, now that all these things are going on, now that these changes are occurring, now that we've got to understand that as you get older, there's a need to have these discussions sooner rather than later. That becomes a decision you kind of have to make on your own, aside from just doing it at the point of when they stop to retire. Your question about finding a mediator is an interesting one, and we can take a look at that and maybe follow up with that on the meetup tonight. But I also will throw out there to you that a big part of doing this, and you mentioned teams and partnerships, a big part of doing this is that there are other people out there who can help you. There's going to be a need perhaps for an estate planner. There's going to be a need for perhaps a financial advisor. There's going to be a need for someone who can talk to you about long-term care. These people can be resources to you. Okay, you don't have to be out there doing this on your own. No adult child has to be an expert in all of these things. View these outside people as resources for you, to yourself. They may lead you to a mediator, or they may be able to play the role of a third party and jump into a discussion and have a discussion where perhaps the parent doesn't want to talk directly to the children, but they're okay talking to their trusted financial advisor or an estate attorney, where they say, I'm going to draw up the will and my estate attorney is going to do that. So there are resources out there. We can look specifically at the mediator question that you bring up and maybe discuss it at the meetup later on.
Sounds good. And the one comment that I'll make is what you're talking about, Jack, is really a holistic approach where you utilize a number of experts instead of trying to do everything yourself. You pull them in as a team and a holistic team. And your having the talk really talks about all of the different types of experts that people should be thinking about that they might need.
That's correct. That's correct. You don't have to go out there and do this on your own. Like I said, there are people out there that you can look at as part of your team here, and your parents may have an advisor that they may be working with, whether it's an insurance person, whether it's a financial advisor, that can play a very valuable role for you here. So you're not going this alone. There are resources out there. Let's take a little bit. I want to spend some time here because a lot of people, they look at this and say, yeah, this is all great, Jack. How do I go and do this? And we're going to talk about some of the questions and some of the resources to this, but let's talk a little bit about the whole need of sitting down and those communication skills and those skills about how do you get the talk done and how do you get the talk started. So let's take a look at the first part. The first part is really that need to have good communications with your parents. And look, there's going to be a lot of adult children out there who are really in the sandwich generation. You're dealing with kids going to college and you're dealing with your parents. It's going to be tough for you to sit down and talk to your parents. But you've got to make the time to do it. It's important to slow down and find the time to be fully present. Put that cell phone down and sit down and have a conversation with your parent. And it's important to listen to what your parent has to say. I mean, think about when you were younger and you had these conversations with your parents and how you remember them. Now it's a real chance for you to sit down and have a good discussion with your parents, but also listening not to what you want, but listening to what the parent has to say. Keep your mind open to their opinion and the options that are available. Now, obviously, you can play a role here. There's certain expertise and knowledge that perhaps you're going to have to really help your parent out, but you need to sit down and need to have good listening skills. You also need to be respectful of them. Okay, even if you feel you know the answer, you need to express your opinion respectfully. This is a time when you've got to play a little bit with your parents, where you've got to understand that the goal here is not to be right. The goal here is to get them to move forward with this and put this plan into place and have the talk and get all these things outlined. That's ultimately what you want to do here. So there may be some times where you may say, I don't want to really create an issue here because I want to basically, the importance of doing this is more important than anything. And it doesn't have to be done in one day. You can put something out there and return to it another day. Okay? Now, if you find that you're frustrated, it's okay to tell your parents how you feel. Because, like I said, this is a partnership. This is something where you want to find some common ground. But also, if you really feel you're not getting anywhere, you may have to back off. You may have to just not badger your parents because you'll end up alienating them and frustrating yourself. So you give it some time and come back to it. As I said, it's a process. It's not something you're going to do in one day. But ultimately, remember that this is not going to be an easy process. You may get frustrated. It will be difficult. You will be on edge. Make sure you take care of yourself and understand what your needs are in going through this. So understand that it's important to take care of yourself, understanding this is not going to be an easy thing, but understand that you take care of yourself. Now let's talk about a game plan. As I mentioned before, it's very important to recognize that you're discussing their lives, not yours. Now ultimately this will have a major impact on your own life, but you're actually helping to remove a burden from your parents, and that is a good way to position it, okay? To really stress how it's benefiting them and how you're helping them first and foremost. And really ensuring that they're going to be helping and taking care of their family as they get older, and you're going to be a conduit to doing that. We talked earlier about involving other family members. I know that there can be some difficulties there, but as much as possible, you need to make sure that this is a team effort, and whether someone's been designated to go and do it or not, or whether it's everyone at the same time, it needs to be understood that all family members are in sync with whatever is discussed here. And as I mentioned before, it's just the beginning. This is going to be the first of many conversations. This is a process. The talk is never a one-shot deal. It's going to take many discussions. It's going to be ongoing. Now, not only is it going to be something that just once you have a plan and once you have everything documented, it still is something that's a living, breathing document. It may need to be reviewed on a regular basis over time. So, but the important part here is to take the first step and begin it. Now, one of the things that I'm asked all the time is, Jack, what are some of the conversation starters? I mean, how do I really, because as I mentioned before, one of the toughest things to do is to really step up and begin this process. So let's talk about what I've found to be some of the conversation starters and the ways to begin this. And I've had a lot of stories from people, and these are some of the best ways that I think in terms of helping to bring this up. One of the best ways that you can bring this up, and it may be somewhat of an indirect way of doing it, but if you bring up some personal stories that relate to how a lack of planning maybe created bad situations or crises for others, that can be a great way to start it. For instance, you can talk about a friend who may be in a similar situation. Let's say that you've got a neighbor or another friend who you can talk about their situation, and you can say to your parents, look, Mary's mom isn't doing well, and it turns out they haven't done any estate planning. Have you and Dad talked about this? You basically say, here's someone else's situation. Have you guys addressed it? By putting them in a situation where they don't want to bring trouble to the family or put the family in another situation like someone else has been in, is a great way to start this. There may be a situation where Uncle Lou, remember what happened to Uncle Lou? Uncle Lou had this thing where he didn't set something up, and all of a sudden all his money went related to his care. If he had done this earlier, look at what would have benefits that would have happened to the family. So using personal stories, you can also use your own situation. Okay, let's say for instance you want to bring this up to your parent and say, "Look, mom, dad, my husband and I are thinking about doing a will. How did you do that?" And view them as a resource and say, how can you help us here? And they are saying, they look at it and they say, "Look, you're looking for my advice. I can help you out here." Or they may say, "We've never done that." So it becomes a joint effort. Really ways to get the conversation started. Very interesting. A side point. I remember going and I was doing a presentation, and one of the people there who I was working with, she came in and she said, "It's interesting. I haven't been." We were up in Sacramento, and she said, "I haven't been in Sacramento in years, and I grew up here." And she said, "Last night I showed up and I saw my parents, and my parents were surprised to see me." And I said, "Yeah, mom and dad, I just wanted to come in and see you guys and just make sure that you hadn't spent all my inheritance," kind of as a joke. And the two parents looked at each other and they said, "You know what, Mary? That's an interesting point that you brought that up. We've been meaning to speak to you about that." So even a joke like that could bring up a discussion. You can also raise perhaps some current news or reference articles that you've read, bring them up to your parents and say, "Did you read this about this new issue? Did you read this about the fact that it's going to cost this much more in additional assets to pay for healthcare costs?" All of those different things can help to be the icebreaker and the conversation starter to getting the talk started.
Jack, I can give you a perfect example, and that is a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, Reuben Baum, a Holocaust survivor, died last year, 97 years old, no heirs, no will, a $40 million estate, and if they cannot find an heir, the money will go to the state government as the largest unclaimed property ever.
Wow.
So that's a perfect example of a story that could be relevant to starting a conversation.
Right, right, right. And I know, Carol, you run into that a lot. I mean, Carol's got some staggering numbers in terms of unclaimed money related to her work, and I know we'll be covering that next week in our webinar about the need for really documenting and creating that life inventory. But that's a great point. I mean, stories like that you can bring up, and they're going to raise the issue for the parent. They're going to say, "I don't want that to happen to you. I don't want to put you through that. I want to make sure I've got everything in place. What do we do? What do we need to do? How do we begin this? How do we get started with this?" Now, we're going to talk now about those aspects that I think need to be included in the talk. And I'm going to come back to a point that I brought up earlier. And this is based on my findings and my research in the area of retirement and later life. That basically, I believe that there's 4 keys to living longer and living well in retirement and later life. And I think when you begin the talk and when you focus on the talk in creating the resources and the tools to have the talk and ask the questions, they need to be around these 4 keys. Now let me talk to what these 4 keys are, because we're going to go into each one of them individually here and give you a battle plan of questions and items that you need to discuss with your parent to constitute the talk. The 4 keys are financial preparedness. Obviously, as we move into retirement and later life, we've got to make sure that we're financially prepared. Health and wellness, very important. Maintaining our health, addressing our health issues, and just monitoring our health and improving our health as we get older. Third one is mental attitude. We're going to get into that, but that's a very, very key point, because as we get older and people age, the reality is life is such that we end up losing friends and family. And there are such changes in our lives that it can cause things such as isolation and depression. And we need to steer clear of that. We need to address those issues. And then the last one, very, very important, it's almost the most important key of all, is the need to stay involved. The importance of having a social structure and a social network for people as they age is very, very important. So this is going to be a holistic talk. This is not just about long-term care. This is about the well-being of your parent and having them live longer and thriving in their later years. And ultimately, it will benefit you and it will benefit the family going forward.
Okay, so what's important to cover in the financial preparedness
Okay, and I'm going to go through each of these different sections. I'm going to put some questions up here. I know we want to move through this. Um, we're uh, we're we've got a lot of information to cover here, which is why we made this in two parts. But I'm going to go through these very quickly here. But the financial preparedness aspect of this is the foundation for moving forward in retirement and having enough money. It's also the foundation for what most of us consider to be involved with the talk. Issues around a will. Have you established a trust? Have you done estate planning? Have you done a financial plan? Have you updated the beneficiaries on your retirement account? But also, do you have a current list of assets, passwords, and important documents, and where they are held? I mean, this is the nuts and bolts of what the talk should be. Documenting, putting all of these things down in writing so that everyone's aware of this. And this is probably the most work intensive type of thing. And this may be a place where you can use a third party. But to Carol's point, and we're going to cover this next week, there's a need to document and put these all in one place. So these are the items that you need to discuss in terms of the financial preparedness aspect of the talk. And ultimately, what you gather in this part of it is you gather all the current information. You understand a bit about their asset allocation, portfolio discussions. You also get a feel and an understanding of all the points of contact for all of their accounts that are out there, but all their centers of influence, their accountants, their financial advisor. I will tell you that my own situation, I remember this with my father-in-law. One of the best things we did was to have a single point of contact related to his financial accounts, so that when things happened, there was one phone call in terms of understanding what we needed to do with his financial accounts. It doesn't mean that there's one phone call to be made with all of this, but you need to understand who are all of the centers of influence, who are all of those people that are involved with your parents, either financial or all bank accounts or whatever. You need to you'll also gather out of this, have there been any estate planning considerations, any work done, what's been done in the wills, what's been done in terms of who's going to who. A lot of this may come out during the talk, but ultimately this is a deliverable that should come out of this. Some estate planning considerations and plans that are put into place. Now, what should also come out of this as well, and I think leads into the next aspect of this, is that there's going to be a need to talk about healthcare costs in retirement. We're seeing this more and more. In the past, there was less of a need to perhaps discuss health and healthcare costs because they weren't as in a runaway situation like they are right now. The reality is health and healthcare costs become a financial matter. So we need to discuss this, and you're going to bring up a lot of information regarding this, and that leads us to the next issue, which is in... Okay, sure. Right.
These are questions that they can use to educate their parents about what is needed, and they can assess how long it's going to take to pull all of this information together. And an example is they can ask their parent, do you have a trust? And the parent may say, what's a trust?
Right.
And it may be, in fact, a journey that the adult child and parents need to jointly pursue and be educated. And that goes back to the team approach that you previously mentioned. The probability is, if they have these things that you've listed, they're scattered, or they're spotty, or they're stale. So I think your questions are great, and that the direction that this needs to go and cover is great. But I want to emphasize that you shouldn't expect that your parents are going to have the answers right at their fingertips.
That's a great point, Carol. It's a great point. These are not questions that you can expect to be answered immediately during the talk, but to Carol's point, they are questions that need to be covered and perhaps lead to an education on what's needed and take a look at finding answers to this. So I think that's a great point, and we're going to see that with all of the other three keys as well, and the questions that are involved there. These are things you may not walk away with answers right away to, but they're important items that need to be considered and discussed during the overall talk. So let's go into the next one, health. And I think health is a very important one, and is a very valid discussion that can be had between parents and their adult children. Questions just about physical checkups and keeping track of who the doctors are that you work with. I mentioned earlier about siblings, and maybe there's one sibling who's better equipped for this. I know in my own situation, I have a sister, she's a director of nursing. She's going to have a better conversation with my parents about their health than I am. She may be the person who may be able to compile that list of their checkups, who their doctors are, medications, all of those things that are very, very important. So she may be the person to gather that. She can document that so it's accessible to the both of us, but she may be better equipped to do it. Big item here, and we could probably spend a whole discussion around this, is the whole talk about end-of-life wishes, the whole issue of terminating life support, advanced healthcare directives. It's a big issue here as well. Let me just let me touch upon that. Carol, I know you have some items there that you've run into related to the importance of that as well.
Oh yes, and it's a really tough question. It's probably the most difficult issue to bring up is to ask a parent what their end of life wishes are.
Right. Right. Without a doubt. Without a doubt. And then also, other questions that are very valid to have, and you may be able to get these questions really in just knowing your parents. I mean, how much stress do they have? Are they stressed out? Are there ways that you need to eliminate this? How healthy is their diet? And also, are they getting some regular exercise? Studies have been out there that the most important thing to extending life is exercise and health. So it's okay to ask your parents these questions related to this. So when you come out of this, ultimately what you end up with is a real view of their current health situations, an understanding of how they're going to maintain or perhaps improve their health. It's okay to say to your parents, Mom, why don't you go walk with Dorothy down the street and get into an exercise program? It's important. Or Dad, doctors told you to stop eating this red meat. You can drive these things home, but it's also going to be a time for you to document doctor information, medications, and also document things such as a living will, discussions related to ultimately nursing homes, and as Carol mentioned before, and plans related to death.
There's also the issue, and I would like to bring this up, that I hope the advanced care directives that you're mentioning, the living will, there's also a healthcare proxy, a power of attorney, a HIPAA release. Those must be notarized, and they must be created before a medical crisis occurs. Because for the adult child, it's great to have the information prior to the crisis, but unless they have an advanced care directive naming them the healthcare proxy and giving them the HIPAA release form, they're not going to be able to get information and make decisions. And that's not a situation that you want to be in with your adult parent. Or for that matter, with your 18-year-old child. Because at the age of 18, your child is emancipated. So if you have an 18-year-old who's going to college or who's still living at home, that child needs to give you their healthcare proxy and their HIPAA release. And it needs to be notarized, and it's state by state. So make sure that you speak with your attorney to find out what the rules are in your state.
Great, Carol. Thanks very much. And I know Carol alerted me to that, and I have a child going into college, so I think that's that's a very interesting point that I wasn't aware of either. Let me go through the last two keys here, and this one here, mental attitude. As I mentioned before, as your parent gets older, they're going to encounter situations where they lose friends and they lose family. Also, the fact is, as they retire and get into a different life stage, this is going to be a big change for them. They're not going to be going to work every day. They're not going to be seeing the same people that they may have seen for 10, 20 years. This is going to be a big change for them. So you've got to recognize and identify with your parents, how are you going to adjust to this? How is this going to impact the way that you spend your time and deal with each day? But it's also, mental attitude is also the time that it's okay to sit down with your parents and say, look, mom, dad, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? What dreams, what goals do you have now that you're retired? What do you really want to do with your life going forward? And it's a great time to really talk to them about what their dreams are. In fact, one of the things that we do with a lot of people that I advise is we do something called the legacy questionnaire, where we really have people sit down and talk about their lives and talk about the legacy and the things that have happened to them and the experiences that they've had, and document those things for the children and for the grandchildren. And it becomes a very mutually beneficial and rewarding experience. So ultimately, when you come out of the mental attitude piece of this, you get a good feel for what your parents' dreams are for retirement. You identify their interests, hobbies, how they're going to stay positive. Things related to maybe spiritual considerations. How are they going to, as people age, there's a little bit more of a concern with making sure that I'm okay with what my belief system is. So these are things that are okay to talk about. Also, brain health. I talked a little bit, I mentioned on the other slide about games and things to improve health, brain health, but also it's an okay time to have a discussion about, if something happens to your mom and dad, what are we going to do? So out of this can come considerations related to caregiving. Who's going to take care of you? What do you really want to have happen to you should this come to pass? So there's a lot in the mental attitude aspect. Right.
I think that these slides are really important because they demonstrate to your parents that you care about things other than money and material items. It reinforces how much you really care about their happiness
Right.
and their staying alive as long as possible.
Right, and that's a very key thing. That's why I said the talk is not just about documenting who's getting the money. The talk is about the well-being of your parents and the well-being of your family. And ultimately, I can think, and research has found that this can help the parent to live longer and really be rewarding for the entire family. The last aspect of this, I think, is very, very important. And there's been numerous studies here that the need to stay involved in creating a social structure for your parents, and just ensuring that your parents have a social structure and have a level of involvement going forward is going to be very, very important. You don't want them to be the solitary person sitting on the couch. It invariably will mean that their life will be shortened. So it's okay to bring up these questions. Once again, to Carol's point, this is not so much about money anymore. This is about caring about their happiness and really caring about their ability to live longer. So you can bring up with them, what kind of hobbies do you have? What kind of volunteering do you want to have? You can be a conduit to helping them with volunteering opportunities. They may also want to do some educational types of things. You can help them with courses on community colleges. You can also help them. One of the biggest, fastest growing groups of people on Facebook and social networks are the elderly. So it's a great way for them to connect with their children and their grandchildren and friends and groups through Facebook and Twitter. We've heard great stories about this, how this has brought joy to a lot of elderly and a lot of retired people. You can be a real conduit to this. So when you come out of this, you get a real feel for now what your parent is going to do, how they're going to interact with, and maybe even provide them some direction, or even provide you some direction in terms of how you can become more involved. Talk a little bit about technology, volunteering interests, their ability to work in retirement, and educational interests as well.
Okay, and I think at that point, the staying involved, when you talk about their social network and you talk about scheduling regular activities, you also want to bring in the safety issues, the security
Right.
issues. I think that's a great time to talk again about potential scams, about not giving out their credit card information or what they should be posting on Facebook. Those are all big topics of conversation these days. And if you know that your parents are out there socially on the internet, you also want to make sure that you know how to get to their accounts
Right, right.
so that when something happens, you will be able to disable them.
You
because the very thing that protects people while they're on the internet can cost thousands and thousands of dollars to try to find out what their passwords were if they didn't tell anybody after the fact.
Right. And much the same way as you're telling your own children how to use social networks, you may have to do the same thing with your parents. You've got to tell your parents that, look, they didn't receive $10 million from some prince in Nairobi. That just is a scam. Okay, so you can really help them in much the same way as you're helping your own children. So when you look at this overall, and I know I want to move forward because we're nearly at the end of our time together. When you've I hope that I've given you the areas of discussion and the importance of why to have these discussions earlier rather than later. And if you've had these discussions, or even if you've begun them, congratulations. As much as possible, once again, come back to that issue of bringing and involving all family members. This is also information that you're going to need to review on a regular basis. And ultimately, as an adult child, this becomes an experience, a fulfilling experience where you've gone and you've done all of this with your parents and have put into place all of these different aspects, and ultimately becomes a process that you can then pass on to your own children with the hope that future generations will also go through this process and that you'll help prepare your children for having these discussions when they need to have these discussions. Now, we've gone through a lot of things, and I think the very important point that I want to cover, and I know we're not going to have a lot of time for questions here, but a very important point to cover is that you've gathered a lot of information. And I want you to come back next week, because next week we're going to talk about what do you do with all of this information? How do you keep track of this? Carol's going to talk about her life inventory system as a way to keep track of all of this information. So I invite you to come back next week. You'll get a reminder to that. But also, I want to just stress something here. I know we're at the end of our time together. I'll send it over to you, Carol, in a second. But if anyone has to run here, I want to stress that we knew that we wouldn't have a lot of time for questions, so that's why we opened up this Google Meetup for tonight, and it's going to occur between 7 and 8 Eastern Time. It's on Google, and what I need from you is, if you have a Gmail address, you can send me an email asking to be invited to it, and my email is a saferetirement@gmail.com. All one word, a saferetirement@gmail.com. If you send me an email, I will send you an invite, and at 7 o'clock tonight, you can get to Google Meetup, and we can have a nice informal discussion there, and I think we'll even have the cameras on, so you can, for good or bad, you can see us in person, but we'll have that tonight. So Carol, with that, I know we're running late on time, so I want to pass it over to you.
Actually, we're running right on time.
Okay, great.
You did a really excellent job. I hope everyone learned a lot. I know that it was you gave a completely new spin on how families can actually break down those barriers, and gave some really good ways that people can talk and start those conversations, which I know are very difficult. So I am looking forward to seeing, or just hearing, the people tonight. We encourage you to join us. We will be on. And Jack, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. If someone would like to get a copy of your book, Having the Talk, how do they get a copy of it?
Yeah, you can go to Amazon. It's also available in Barnes and Noble, but you go to Amazon. It's called Having the Talk, the 4 Keys to Your Parents' Safe Retirement. It is available on Amazon, as well as it should be in your local Barnes and Noble. You can go to my site, www.safe4retirement.com, for also a link to it, as well as some other information related to the book, to the talk book, and then also related to my first book. We also put a lot of the latest information regarding retirement and estate planning up there as well. So, Carol, it was my pleasure to do this. Once again, I invite everyone to come back next week for a great presentation by Carol Kaufman, where she's going to go over life inventory and really a great follow-up to everything that we've discussed today.
Well, thank you. The one question that people have asked, Jack, is will there be a PowerPoint presentation of the slides available? And have we done a recording of this? Do you want to take that?
Well, we will get back to everyone Yeah, we'll get back to everybody on that. At this point, we need to take a look at the data that we have and the information we have, and we'll let everyone know through an email related to that.